Yeah. mm, Good morning and good afternoon to all. We welcome you to the sixth lecture in the Teaknet webinar series. Today we have Dr. Ernest Foli amongst us to deliver the lecture on management models for incorporation of trees in farming systems in Ghana. Dr. Foli is a principal research scientist at the CSIR Forest Research and Management Institute. He has a vast experience of nearly 32 years in tropical forest silviculture and management. And his areas of specialization includes forest ecology, forest mensuration and inventory, forest growth and yield modeling, forest biomass and carbon stock assessment, and forest landscape restoration. He is a member of numerous professional associations and organizations such as UFRO, the ATBC, FORNESA, and the UNFF. He was a member of the independent group of scientists appointed by the UN General Assembly to draft the 2019 GSDR. We are fortunate to have Dr. Foli, and over to you, sir, for the lecture.
Thank you very much for the kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my delight this morning, probably afternoon or evening, wherever you might be, to share with you experiences in Ghana in plantation management models that incorporate trees in farming systems. By way of introduction, forest degradation and deforestation have been of concern in Ghana for many years, so especially since the 1900s. And so efforts have been made since that time, especially between 1900 and 1910, to restore those degraded forest areas. More recently, in response to the recent global call for forest landscape restoration, Ghana has pledged to restore 2 million hectares of degraded forest lands by 2030 under the Bond Challenge and African Forest Restoration Initiatives. The restoration commitment has a strong focus on community and private sector involvement, and it's made up of three broad components. The first one is forest plantations covering about 250,000 hectares, mainly including wood fuel or energy plantations. The second one is enrichment planting within 50,000 hectares of degraded forest reserves. And the third is trees on farm covering about 1.7 million hectares, principally using climate-smart agriculture. The approaches that we are adopting are generally aligned with the principles for forest landscape restoration, where we are looking at restoring ecological integrity, improving the well-being and livelihoods of local communities. In this presentation, I would like to discuss the key forest plantation management models in Ghana that focus on integration of trees in farming systems. I will also discuss the enabling conditions for success, the constraints and lessons learned in implementation, and the outlook for the future. Historically, plantation activities in Ghana date back, as I said, to the 1900s. And at that time, it was aimed at increasing the stock of timber for commercial purposes because there was a fear that the rate at which the forest was being harvested would result in a time that we'll have a shortage of timber. And so during the 1920s, teak was planted mainly for fuel wood in boilers to supply electricity. But in the late 1930s, when the plantation culture was actually, the need to speed it up was recognized, the tundra system was introduced. The primary aim of replanting impoverished forest reserves with exotic tree species so that we could obtain timber in a relatively short time because these exotic species like teak were known to be fast growing. So the system allowed trees to be planted alongside with food crops and eventually became plantations. Of course, with canopy closure, because they involved farmers who grew the food crops, they could no longer stay on the plantations to farm and therefore had to move to other degraded forest areas. And these were principally managed, state-managed forest reserves. By 1985, approximately 82,500 hectares had been established with plantations of exotic species and some indigenous species. The exotics included teak, citrulla, and eucalyptus. Some malina also was grown. The indigenous species included Mansonia, Heritiera, Nauclea, Kaya ivorensis, Rifkaiton, Terminalia sperba, and Terminalia ivorensis. Now, since 2001, the National Forest Plantation Development Program has deployed 3 management models for plantation development. Firstly, it goes with partnering with farmers to establish plantations through what we call the modified tundra system. I shall describe the tundra system that have been used in a minute. The second one was directly establishing industrial plantations using contractors under a public-private partnership arrangement. Thirdly, the Forestry Commission released land in degraded forest reserves to private entities to establish plantations. Now, let's look at the tundra system as was practiced between 1963 and 1985. 2 different models were used. In the first case, local farmers were engaged to clear the sites to plant the food crops between 3 seedlings for up to 3 years. After 3 years, because of canopy closure, it wasn't practical for them to continue cultivating their crops under the tree shade and therefore had to move to other areas. Under this model, at maturity, financial benefits went to the Forestry Commission or Forestry Department and the traditional authorities, but the farmers did not benefit from the proceeds because theirs was just the food crops that they would have harvested in the first instance. And this led to lack of farmer commitment because they were really not interested in maintaining the seedlings on the farms. In the second model, the Forestry Department itself hired labor to prepare the site, and then the food crops were planted. But when the food crops were harvested, they were sold to defray the cost of initial plantation establishment. These 2 practices were not successful, principally because there was lack of silvicultural maintenance, including thinning and pruning. There were no wildfire prevention and management plans. And where farmers were engaged, there was lack of farmer commitment, as I said earlier. So, seeing, of course, that the tundra system had some potential, the Forestry Commission devised what we call now the modified tundra system through consultation with the key stakeholders, including traditional chiefs and farmers. Here, the key elements are that free fertile land within degraded portions of forest reserves were allocated to forest range communities. And there was properly developed criteria for equitable allocation of land to support the communities and the individual farmers. There was proper allocation of prompt allocation of new farming areas to farmers, especially when canopy closed. And then, of course, this was subject to availability of land. And this system was practiced principally in areas where there's land shortage for agricultural purposes, and therefore to avoid communities and farmers encroaching into those forest reserves to degrade them further. It was found useful to engage them on this modified tundra basis. In this system, the farmers provide the necessary labor and bear the percentage of the cost of establishment. And at maturity, they're entitled to about 40% share of the benefits from the tree crops. And this is based on an agreement that is signed initially between the Forestry Commission and each interested farming community. Farmers are responsible for tending the crops even after canopy closure until maturity. There are several factors that were taken into account, and this includes the level of local participation of the community groups or farmer groups, the establishment costs, growth rates, and of course productivity. Land accessibility and security of tenure was well defined together with enforceable property rights just to ensure that there was security on the farms. And then, of course, the annual plan of work and all activities have to be prepared with details of operations to be carried out and the resources required. In addition, we had to consider nursery production by seedlings and stumps for planting. Certainly, there were benefits to be derived from the modified plunger system. Of course, it leads to increase in forest cover. Land scarcity for farming in the French communities is reduced because they have access to free fertile lands within the degraded portions of the forest reserves. This increased food production and improved the standards of living of the communities that were involved. Again, establishment cost is minimized because we have farmers responsible for tending the tree crops all the way to maturity. And there was benefits to those respective stakeholders in proportions that were stipulated in the agreement and backed by law. But there were challenges as well. There was inadequate funding to cover activities because it was mostly dependent on farmers to manage the farms. There were delays in signing the benefit sharing agreement with stakeholders. The forestry staff had too many commitments and therefore were unable to effectively supervise the activities of the farmers. And the farmers received inadequate education to enable them to fulfill the obligations under the agreement. Now, there was also the public-private partnership model. In this model, the Forestry Commission allocates land to degraded forest areas to private sector for plantation development. The contribution of the Forestry Commission is to prepare the project documents, bear the cost of survey and demarcation, register the agreements, and provide fire education within the French communities. The investor or the private investor is entitled to 80% of the proceeds of plantation and the benefits that derived thereof. And the Forestry Commission, the landowners, the forestry communities then share the remaining 20% of the proceeds. In addition, the investor has to pay ground rent to the landowner with a facilitation fee for customary and conflict resolution rule that will be expected by the traditional authorities. And for security, a 50-year land lease and benefit sharing agreement is prepared and is executed at the Lands Commission. Let me just cite an example of this public-private partnership model. There is this agreement between the Forestry Commission and the timber industry to establish 50,000 hectares of plantations in degraded forest reserves. So far, about 3,000 hectares have been planted by the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana, which has been contracted to establish and manage these plantations as model industrial plantations. We have planted mostly native species, but proven exotics such as teak, citrella, and melina have also been planted, and all these are to satisfy the future needs of the timber industry. And similar to the other efforts I have described, community engagement has been key to ensure successful establishment of these plantations, providing jobs for the local communities and improving upon their livelihoods. So let me just give you an outlook of public and private sector plantation efforts between 2000 and 2015. You can see from the chart that there is significantly higher proportion of areas planted by the public sector in comparison to the private sector, but there has been a decline in the number of hectares that have been planted by the public sector between 2004 and 2015. In fact, it's gone down significantly. But at the same time, total areas planted by the private sector has been increasing gradually and has almost outstripped public sector efforts by about 2015. Now, there's also the community managed plantations model. And since 2015, we have had two key projects that have been initiated, funded by the World Bank and the African Development Bank. These are under the Forest Investment Program. The first is enhancing natural forest and agroforest landscapes. And the other one is engaging local community involvement in REDD+ and enhancing forest carbon stocks. The first project aims at restoring 40,000 hectares in enrichment planting, while the second one aims at establishing 5,000 hectares of tree plantations, in addition to 16,000 hectares of climate-smart cocoa agroforestry and 1,200 hectares in wood fuel lots. The aim is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under REDD class regime, but at the same time reduce poverty, conserve biodiversity, and improve forest and cocoa management practices of farmers in the selected landscapes. Under these projects, so far about 24,900 hectares of native species have been established, involving about 159 forestry communities. The projects have successfully enhanced landscape-level tree growing in the cocoa landscape, including agroforest corridors, with active engagement or involvement of the local communities to increase tree cover in the degraded forest reserves. In addition, we have engaged about 5,564 families that have been supported with a supply of about 1.6 billion seedlings of native species to plant on their farms and farm boundaries as a way of securing the boundaries of the farms. Approximately 28,571 hectares of mosaic cocoa landscapes have so far been established with native tree species on farms, and these are outside the forest reserves. Also, of 8,543 hectares of native species have been established through enrichment planting in degraded forest reserves. Certainly, these efforts have been possible because there have been some enabling conditions for plantation development. Principally, Ghana's efforts have been supported by several policy and regulatory frameworks. Firstly, the National Land Policy provides guidance and direction on land ownership, security of tenure, land use, etc. Then there's also the Timber Resource Management Act that prevents the government from allocating timber utilization contracts to timber coming from private plantations. The Forestry Plantation Development Act, Fund Act, also provides substantial financial support for plantation development, and this is made available to private entities that want to engage in plantation development. And finally, the Forest and Wildlife Policy of 2012 supports the implementation of the National Forest Plantation Strategy. On top of all of these, Ghana's commitment to a green economy and its endorsement of several international agreements, including REDD+, FLEGT, the Bond Challenge, and the Sustainable Development Goals, create an enabling environment for forest landscape restoration efforts. But these do not go without constraints. 85% of total commitment to landscape restoration is expected from deforested agricultural landscapes. These are outside forest reserves. And much of this will be on customary land with a focus on community and private sector involvement. Now, these are constrained by land tenure and access to land. There's multiple issuance of land certificates, land registration bottlenecks, and inadequate capital and incentives even worsen the problem further. As a result, restoration efforts so far tend to be confined to degraded forest reserves. And there are clear examples of successful efforts where we have, for example, a 6-year-old mixed indigenous species plantation that has been established by the private sector in the forest area, forest reserve, as you can see in the picture on the right. There are other examples. We have trees on farms where indigenous tree species have been grown in combination with food crops to restore the degraded forest lands, at the same time providing food and livelihood opportunities to forest-free communities. If you see the pictures here on the left, was a degraded forest reserve, completely deforested, so to say. But with intervention in collaboration with local communities, you can see the picture on the right 4 years after a restoration effort. You can see that the trees have almost closed canopy and now resembling the forest. Another example you see in the picture on the left It's a degraded forest area in Southern Cap Forest Reserve, 8 years after restoration. Similarly, on the right, you find a deforested area in Crown Forest Reserve that has been restored, and you can see 6 years after restoration, the trees beautifully growing in that area. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that Ghana's commitment to meeting her obligations of restoring 2 million hectares of deforested and degraded landscapes by 2030 in contribution to the global restoration efforts is still key. And while tea constitutes about 70% of species planted so far, we are increasingly adding indigenous tree species in plantations for the purposes of conserving biodiversity and improving the livelihoods of people. But access to land, tree tenure, security remain critical constraints. And the land policy requires some revisions to harmonize customary and statutory laws so that we can enhance effective private sector and community participation in landscape restoration efforts. Also, legislation in respect of tree tenure and rights will have to be clarified speedily in order to enhance forest landscape restoration activities, especially outside forest reserves. Within forest reserves, for sure, because it is state managed, it is possible to allocate land without any hindrances to those who have been engaged in the process. But outside forest reserves, because of tenure issues, it becomes critical that the tenure rights are clarified so that participants can successfully engage in restoration efforts. Success in scaling up of restoration efforts depend on improvements in governance by enhancing participatory forest management and participatory monitoring, providing access to adequate capital and incentives, and above all, diversifying livelihood opportunities, especially with regard to the modified tundra system. This is because as farmers continue to tend the trees to maturity, there is nothing or there's not much to improve on their livelihood conditions. But if we can diversify the livelihood options, for example, including tree species that can grow in the shade in the plantations, at least they can harvest this in the course of time to improve upon their livelihoods until trees grow to maturity. And again, it is important that we ensure effective enforcement and compliance with the forest legislation, because this is key to strengthening the various models of plantation development if Ghana has to achieve its commitment to the Bond Challenge, AFR 100, REP+, and other initiatives. And so with that, I would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I can take some questions at this point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Foli. We have one question from Dr. Devendra Pandey.
Yes.
What was the reason for decline of forest planted area by public sector?
Basically, it has to do with funding. The Forestry Commission especially has so many commitments other than engaging in plantation establishment. And over the years, the resources available for going into the plantation culture has declined more or less. But of course, it is picking up again, as I described in the community managed plantations. It still has a very strong public support, and with funding coming from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, there is substantial increase in plantation efforts through the public sector.
Okay. Yeah. Another question is, what is the harvestable age of teak, especially that are raised in farms?
It depends very much on the ecological or the site conditions, because we have different areas in drier soils and then wetter areas. The growth rate of teak is rather slow in those wet areas. And so depending on site conditions, we're looking at 15 to 25 years in certain cases. In areas where the soil condition is good, we are looking at growth rates of about 2.5 centimeters per year. And therefore, you can expect to harvest maybe from about 15 years onwards. But of course, there is intermediate tenants that you can also harvest for poles and other purposes.
Yeah, there is another interesting question that Dr. Foli had said that teak is an exotic species in Ghana. So Dr. Sir would like to know where did Ghana get the teak source, teak seed source, and which is the model most successful one among the different modified Tongia systems in Ghana?
That's an interesting question. Ghana has had teak into the country from about the 1930s, I should say, introduced by the Germans, but I think principally from Burma. But later, we have also had provenance trials. So we have had source teak from Indonesia, Burma, Laos, and other Asian countries. What was the second question?
Which model do you consider as the most successful among the different modified Tongia systems?
Oh, yes, the involvement of the communities especially, and with the benefit sharing arrangement where the farmers get up to 40% of the proceeds seems to be the most successful so far. And even the private sector is also engaging farmers to that extent, where they can also have these benefits at the end of the rotation.
Okay. Yeah. And I would like to know what is the level of preparation that has gone into the RED Plus implementation or the preparedness of the RED Plus programs?
Indeed, Ghana has already passed this piloting stage, so to say. And so far, we have, I think, 2 main projects in the pipeline which have been endorsed or approved by the World Bank, for example, under the Forest Carbon Partnership Fund. There is a Ghana Cocoa Forestry Plus project, which is already just about to take off. And then there's also the Share Landscape RED Plus project, which is also about to take off. So these are looking at different ecological zones, the forest area and also the savanna area. In addition to that, we are already piloting, as I mentioned, under those 2 projects funded by the World Bank, enhancing natural forest and agroforest landscapes, and then also the LCR Plus, which involves engaging local communities and RED Plus and enhancing forest carbon stocks. So I would say that Ghana is quite ahead in implementation of RED Plus in the country.
Yeah. Some of our experiences shows that the Tongia systems, especially in slopy lands, causes land degradation by way of erosion and all. What is your observation on this?
Yes, fortunately, again, because most of these activities, plant restoration activities, are governed by the Forestry Commission, as much as possible, we avoid these restoration efforts in sloping land. As those degraded forests where there are slopes above a certain inclination, we rather want to do enrichment planting rather than going to actual Tongia farming where, but in most cases, in fact, the degradation is limited to, it's not so rampant in slope hill areas.
Yeah. Bedijo posed a question. How do you ensure tree growers receive adequate technical advice to manage their teak plantations?
The Forestry Commission has an extension unit that provides technical assistance to tree growers, both the private sector and even individuals who want to go into plantation development.
Doreen has a question, and is there any planting of clonal teak in Ghana?
Yes, with the in about 1980, 85 thereabouts, there was an international provenance trial in which Ghana participated. There were several other countries anyway, funded by Danida. One of the key benefits for Ghana is that we were able to determine the best provenance. And so the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana, unfortunately, I cannot remember which the best provenance was, but the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana established clonal orchards.
Okay.
And therefore, we have been able to source seeds from these orchards for plantation development. And I must add that the Forestry Research Institute of Ghana manages the National Tree Seed Center. And so we are able to store some of these seeds that we are able to supply to plantation developers and even to the Forestry Commission.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there are no more questions in the chat box. We are extremely thankful to Dr. Ernest Foli for sparing his valuable time and speaking on an important topic on the different management models for farming systems in Ghana. With his vast experience, he had tried to explain all the different questions that had come to our that had popped up in the minds of the participants. And thank you, Dr. Foli. Thank you once again.
Thank you also. It has been my delight and pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.